CNRM is a collaborative effort that involves the National Institutes of Health, but particularly the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, to help the patients there with TBI, traumatic brain injury, and to some extent post-traumatic stress disorder as well. This group is very unique in terms of the collaborations because it brings together federal agencies locally. So right here in Bethesda, adjacent institutions, we have the Department of Defense with the Uniformed Services University and Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and the National Institute of Health. So the investigators involved here help the traumatic brain injury patients that are at Walter Reed, which is right in the middle of the Uniformed Services and the National Institute of Health. Not every head injury will cause brain damage. The brain is actually the best protected organ in the body. Your skull does that. The fluid around your brain helps to do that. So that's a good thing. But it's also the most complex organ in the body. So there are a lot of ways it can be damaged.
There is a huge overlap between the symptom manifestations, or the way patients will present with traumatic brain injury, and the way they'll present with post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of those symptoms are the same in both conditions, and we want to look at the differences between those types of injuries or injuries that might happen in a deployed setting. For example, exposure to a blast, exposure to debris from a blast, ballistic injuries or shrapnel injuries to the head. All those different things can affect the brain differently, and we need to better understand those in order to take care of our service members that are willing to put their lives in harm's way.
So the goal of all the work is to provide new treatments or the best treatments available to a given patient to then improve their outcome from a given stage of traumatic brain injury. And no treatment that we know of now really can tell us exactly how to do that. So we have to do the research, we have to depend on the volunteers to participate and really see what measures are going to work.
There's several different ways that we recruit participants for our studies. One is we have a presence at multiple military facilities throughout the DC metropolitan area, as well as civilian hospitals like Suburban Hospital, Washington Hospital Center. Our study staffs at those sites may approach them directly, talk to them about our study, and they may need some time to think about it, and that way they're calling me after they've had some time to think about it. Other ways they could learn about us is NIH has this patient recruitment office where they constantly get new patients who can choose on what kind of studies they want to participate in. In that case, they will send us information about those patients directly, and I'm the one to contact them. You may also learn about our study because your doctor or family, friend, caregiver, they could have heard about us from any of these avenues. So after they contact me, depending on how they learned about our study and how they found out about our number, I provide them with a brief overview about what CNRM is. And if they agree, then I do a quick pre-screen over the phone. Usually takes about maybe 10 minutes of their time only. And depending on whether they would like to do an in-person evaluation or over the phone only because they're not able to travel for an in-person visit, then we will follow up accordingly.
The goal is to minimize the burden on the patients so that they're not being asked by many different studies. If they're interested, instead we contact them and talk to them and ask them what they're interested in participating in, and then we can refer them to whatever studies they're interested in. Once you're in a study, you can decide to stop participating at any time. So there's no commitment on your end. Anything that you don't feel comfortable with, you don't have to do.
When we first start a study, we do what's called an informed consent process. So I will go over a consent form with them. That explains all of the details of the procedures to them, and I try to convey all of that in as understandable terms as possible and ask them if they have any questions, have them repeat some of it back to me so I know that they understand what the study involves. And as part of that, I make it clear to them that they are free to withdraw at any time. So even though they sign a consent form saying they agree to take part, they can change their mind anytime.
Well, after a nearly 30-year career in the military, I know very well what it's like to be scared of confidentiality and how that might affect one's military career. One thing I noticed over my career in the Army is that it never did. So there's this stigma attached to seeing somebody in behavioral health or admitting that you have a traumatic brain injury, and somehow that's going to adversely affect your career, and that's just not the case. And in fact, it can be just the opposite. If you have a behavioral health problem or you have a problem with brain injury and that adversely affects your performance and your command does not know about that or address that, it would be more likely to negatively impact your career by not having those issues addressed than by having those issues addressed.
Blast injuries can be very severe or can be very subtle, and sometimes subtle changes can be unrecognized. People come home and they're a little bit different. They might be a little bit anxious, might have trouble sleeping, might have headaches, might be forgetful. And if you're home and things aren't right, it's a good idea to check and see what could be wrong. The deployment time should not be a consideration with regard to enrolling in a study. There are many studies where there's an initial encounter and that takes place at a medical facility, and other things are conducted by email, by telephone, by distance, and are accomplished yearly or can have gaps of several months or years in between and still be part of a study and still give us valid information.
The things we do in our long-term study is really do an in-depth analysis, a 2 to 4 day in-depth analysis of their cognitive function, their physical function, how their brain looks on an MRI, their blood biomarkers. And so to a certain extent, that is of use to some individuals. And then many individuals and volunteers just do it because they feel like they want to give back. And ultimately they want to help find cures for these really, really difficult problems.
So in radiology, there's different technologies that we can use to image the human body, and in our case, the brain. The most commonly studied technologies for studying the brain are going to be MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and PET, which stands for positron emission tomography. What MRI does is it uses a very powerful magnet as well as radio frequency waves, the same kind of radio frequency waves that you listen to your car radio on, for example, to generate images of the human body. It's very good at showing structural information about the brain. There's essentially no preparation except maybe letting us know what kind of metal or electronics that you might have in your body. If you have something implanted, it's important that you find out what's the make and model of that implant so that we can look it up and make sure that it's MRI safe. Once you get to the MRI check-in area, we'll ask you to take all electronics and metal out of your pockets. Anything that can be removed should be removed, and we'll change you into a hospital gown for the duration of the scan. PET has the advantage of showing where specific molecules are being taken up by the brain. That's why PET imaging is also often known as molecular imaging. For PET, what we do is we inject a radioactive tracer into the body. This radioactive tracer usually decays pretty rapidly so that you're no longer radioactive after a short period of time. This radioactive tracer is taken by different tissues in the body, and that lets us generate images of the brain through a different mechanism. The more information we gather about using these techniques, both in healthy and unhealthy brains, symptomatic and unsymptomatic brains, the faster we'll be able to get to an answer about how these can help patients who are exposed to trauma or stress.
The image processing core develops and applies computer algorithms to help extract information from medical images that are acquired through MRI or PET. So CNRM was one of the first installations of a simultaneous PET MRI scanner within the United States. So our group has developed a patent-pending procedure to actually see missing connections perhaps, or shortened connections. And then there's also a large number of quantitative measurements that characterizes how well connected different regions within the brain are connected to each other. And we can compare that across individuals, between healthy individuals and unhealthy individuals and see what the differences are. So if there's a healing process or repairing process, we can monitor that, especially if there's a therapy that's being administered to the patient.
We use peripheral samples of blood because that's what's available to us in these individuals who have mild or moderate injuries, and that we can get a sample of blood just as a clinical routine, and we can actually use that blood and understand what's going on in the brain through a lot of different processes. And what we're looking for in that blood is identifiers that might make somebody more at risk to have neurological deficits or psychological symptoms following a brain injury. And so we use that blood to look at things like proteins, maybe inflammation. We also look at the function of genes to better understand how genes might play in to some of the recovery networks that we know are implicated in traumatic brain injury, but we're not quite sure how to treat it. So we're using the biomarkers as a way to identify patients at risk, as well as to identify ways that we might be able to treat them better.
Well, CNRM Biospecimen Repository, we receive specimens from various clinical sites. And with that, the specimens that we receive are de-identified. And de-identified basically means that we do not receive any patient information, such as their name, social security number, date of birth, or gender. Then we store them into our secure freezers. They're locked in a designated space so that we're the only ones who have access to them. You have investigators who will request samples from the blood that we receive from the patients. And with that, they will take and run specific assays. And in that, they might find various markers within the assays that they're doing that would help give us a better understanding of traumatic brain injury and better ways to treat it for the betterment of the patient.
In CNRM and in research in general, there are two types of trials that involve human beings. One is what we call a natural history study, in which we take a group of individuals, like individuals with PTSD or like individuals with TBI, and we follow them over a long period of time. And so very much what natural history studies allow us to do is generate hypotheses around what the enemy is. The other type of trial that we do here is something called a treatment trial or an experimental trial. And that's an experiment, and we're actually trying to test whether one intervention works better or worse than another. So for instance, a classic experimental trial would be a drug trial in which you do a placebo-controlled trial where you give somebody a pill every day, and that individual may or may not know whether or not that's the experimental pill or a sugar pill. So those are the two types of trials, and we do both of them here.
We've been using virtual reality, virtual Iraq and virtual Afghanistan, since about 2007, so about more than 7 years now. And we were the first to show that the function of the brain significantly improves with that treatment. So they say a little bit about what happened to them, and then the therapist creates some of that in the virtual environment. It's more attractive to service members because, frankly, a lot of our younger soldiers, they're used to playing video games, being immersed in this kind of a world. And so it's appealing to them. They might say, well, yeah, talk therapy, I don't know, I don't really want to talk to somebody about this. I don't want to take another medicine. But virtual reality, wow, that sounds kind of cool. Sure, I'll come in. So it gets their foot in the door.
One of the things we do here is an interesting test called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we like to do this over the part of the brain that controls the muscles on the other side of the body, an area called the motor cortex. And that way, when we stimulate, we can look at how big the muscle twitch is. And that tells us a lot about the sensitivity of the brain and how it changes under various conditions.
When patients have a head injury or other types of neurological disorders, it frequently affects their thinking, their memory, their speed, the speed at which they process information, their ability to shift their attention. And what clinical neuropsychologists do are measure out those cognitive abilities, such as memory, attention, things like that. After a patient has an injury, as you say, they may or may not know if they're functioning at the level they were before. One of the things that we do is we also estimate what their functioning was prior to the injury. So by being able to determine sort of where they were before and where they are now, we can make a more objective assessment of where they're having problems and what those problems may be.
So we think of the Center for Neuroscience and Regenerative Medicine as a catalyst for brain injury research. And we do that because the center brings together these institutions and the investigators and their expertise to really focus and increase the interactions that would help us develop these new technologies and new treatments and really accelerate the brain injury research that we can do. So we have to do the research, we have to depend on the volunteers to participate and really help us to bring these new methods for diagnosis and evaluation and to bring new treatments forward that we just wouldn't otherwise have had the opportunity to offer.
Together, we can make a difference in better recognizing traumatic brain injury in civilians and individuals who have been deployed to really improve the lives of their families, the individuals, and society as a whole.
Together, we can make a difference.
Together, we can make a difference.
Together, we can make a difference.
Together.
Together,
We can make a difference.
Together, we can make a difference.
Please visit our website at www.cnrmstudies.org. Subscribe to our Facebook page, Twitter feed, and YouTube channel, where you will have constant access to TBI and PTSD resources. Please give us a call. We would love to hear from you. Together, we can make a difference.